And welcome to this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Hennig. This week on the podcast, I want to touch on what it means to be patient with young quarterbacks and what goes into the development of players from their first year to their fourth year in the NFL. Also going to touch on Stan Lee passed away this week. My thoughts and perspective on Stan Lee. A little different perspective on the impact of the man behind the Marvel Universe in the comics and in the movies. Also going to touch on why Jimmy Butler is so misunderstood by the media and fans and other players in the NBA, along with the latest faux pas from Supergirl, and where again the show misses the mark in an attempt to differentiate itself from other shows. So let's open a cold one and get started right here on the Mutant Blitz Podcast. Topic number one on this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I want to touch on a topic that's been circulating around the NFL in the last couple of weeks, and it specifically evolves out of some of the discussion coming out of New York. So the rookie Sam Darnold, look, he is a rookie, and he has had his positives and negatives this year. You know, he was the third overall pick in the NFL draft. He went to a team, for all intents and purposes, not that talented of a football team. Despite the fact that he's not on a great football team, he has played well at times this year. Now, his last game he played, no touchdowns, 4 interceptions. People, though, as usual, are overreacting. Yes, Darnold leads the NFL in interceptions this season. But what gets overlooked about young quarterbacks is that throwing interceptions is part of the development of a young quarterback. People look at a guy like Sam Darnold and they expect a certain level of result because we've seen what Patrick Mahomes has done in Kansas City. And people make this assumption that that's what Darnold should be able to do as well. Forgetting the fact that a guy like Patrick Mahomes in Kansas City, he is a guy who, first of all, sat out his entire first year in the NFL. He didn't play until the final week of the season, what was basically garbage time, a throwaway game for the Kansas City Chiefs, because they already clinched a playoff spot. Mahomes has a Pro Bowl caliber running back. He has a all-pro wide receiver, an all-pro tight end. He has one of the best offensive minds and quarterback coaches in the NFL, and Andy Reid as his head coach. Also, he has an offensive staff with Brad Childress, who spent an entire 2 years researching what they're doing in college football, and he went to Andy Reid, and they worked on this offseason how to bring concepts that Pat Mahomes did in college to the NFL. Sam Darnold has none of those advantages. He's on a team where his best wide receivers are Robbie Anderson and Quincy Enunwa, two guys who are nice, solid players, but neither one of them are on the same level as Travis Kelce or Tyreek Hill. But yet, what do people focus on? The interceptions, the low completion percentage. What they don't focus on is that if it wasn't for Darnold, they wouldn't have their 3 wins this year. He was very good week 1 versus the Detroit Lions. In the game versus the Broncos, he had 3 touchdowns and 1 interception while his running game went off against the Broncos. When he had that shootout with the Colts, he beat Andrew Luck one-on-one, 2 touchdowns, 280 passing yards. Now, since then, he has struggled. Since that Colts win, yes, in the next 3 games, he only threw 2 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. But what you're overlooking about Darnold is that this is part of being a rookie quarterback. Jared Goff was not great his first year. He got a better head coach in Sean McVay. He was much better the next year. You look at the history of quarterbacks, especially in the last 20, 25, 30 years in the NFL. Brett Favre's first full season in the NFL. Peyton Manning's first full season as a starter in the NFL. Ben Roethlisberger's first 15, 16 games as a full season as a starter in the NFL. So all those quarterbacks I just named, Favre, Manning, and Roethlisberger, all 3 are Super Bowl champions. All 3 have been among the best quarterbacks in the NFL when they played. But the first time that all 3 of those quarterbacks started 15 and 16 games in a season, what happened? They all led the league in interceptions. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that's a part of the maturation of the quarterbacks. If you Recall back to my podcast last week, I was explaining about how quarterbacks process information. And I purposely used Favre, Manning, and Roethlisberger to speak about Sam Darnold because Favre was a see-it-and-throw-it quarterback. Peyton Manning was a hybrid quarterback, so he could see it and throw it, and he could anticipate when it came to processing information. Roethlisberger is also a hybrid quarterback. He anticipates and he sees it and throws it. Darnold's skill set is much closer to Roethlisberger than it is the other quarterbacks who were drafted in the 2018 NFL Draft. You look at his contemporaries. Josh Rosen is an anticipation quarterback. You look at a guy like Josh Allen, he's a see-it-and-throw-it quarterback. Lamar Jackson, see-it-and-throw-it quarterback. Baker Mayfield, see-it-and-throw-it quarterback. Darnold is the only true hybrid in this year's draft of the quarterbacks, and part of it has to do with his just how he processes information. Roethlisberger has never been a stranger to the interception. Peyton Manning's whole career wasn't touchdowns and no interceptions. In fact, if you compare Peyton Manning and Drew Brees' careers, you're going to find that Peyton Manning has made more mistakes in the regular season and the postseason than Drew Brees has. So when we're talking about young quarterbacks, what we're doing is we're making an assumption about these players that is unfair to them. You look at the current crop of quarterbacks who came before Sam Darnold. Carson Wentz, Jameis Winston, Marcus Mariota, Dak Prescott, Derek Carr, Blake Bortles. When you look at all of those quarterbacks through their first 36 games, Carson Wentz has the most touchdowns of the group, 64. But the quarterback with the least interceptions, Dak Prescott. The quarterback with the best completion percentage, Dak Prescott. The quarterback with the worst completion percentage, Blake Bortles. Through their first 36 games, Carson Wentz and Dak Prescott are the only one of those 6 players that have more than 20 wins. Why is that? Because Wentz and Prescott are surrounded by better talent. Winston has been playing for a much more mediocre football team and has thrown a lot more interceptions as a result. Marcus Mariota, worst football team, 17-19 record through his first 36 games. Derek Carr, 13-23 for his first 36 games. 62 touchdowns looks good. 7 comeback victories in the fourth quarter looks good as well. But his team still wasn't winning games. A quarterback's success, as I've told you before, is so hyper-dependent on who is around him. Carson Wentz was on a team that won the Super Bowl, and they did it without him. But he was playing like an MVP before he got injured last year. Blake Bortles has more playoff wins already than Andy Dalton does in his entire career. Dak Prescott has made the postseason. Marcus Mariota has playoff wins. The only guys on this list who have really not met their potential, full potential yet, is Jameis Winston and Derek Carr. The other 4 have all been on teams that have reached the postseason. So what's the difference? The difference is that while Darnold is on a not-so-good team, Wentz, Mariota, and Prescott and Bortles have played for better football teams. Don't judge Sam Darnold purely based on the team around him. When you're evaluating a quarterback from year 1 to year 4, here are the stages of development. There are 3 things you want to watch for. Number 1, does the quarterback make the same mistake again and again? For example, Peyton Manning, when he led the league in interceptions, not every interception was identical. Almost every interception was a different type of throw. Whether it was he made the wrong anticipation, or he made the wrong read on the defense, or he was trying to force the ball into a spot he shouldn't have, or he overthrew a receiver, he would underthrow a receiver, he stepped up into the wrong area of the pocket. Peyton Manning didn't go on to become a multiple-time league MVP by accident. He learned from his mistakes and didn't keep making them again. The second tip into understanding if a quarterback is developing is look at what he is doing from year 1 to year 2 to year 3. Because year 2 could sometimes be rocky as well for a quarterback. We saw what happened with Jameis Winston. Jameis Winston started out his second season, he had some issues. Now, he got better as the year progressed, but then he regressed again. Whereas you compare him to a guy like Andrew Luck. Andrew Luck, his year 1 to year 2, much different progression. Jared Goff, exponential progression from year 1 to year 2. Tip 3, when you're looking at a young quarterback's development in his first few years of NFL career, does he adjust to the adjustments? So, for example, the more teams see a quarterback, the more film they have on him, the more they can read his tendencies with his footwork, with his eyes, with his throwing motion. Look at a guy from Andrew Luck's quarterback class. It was Luck, Robert Griffin III, who drafted 1 and 2 in that draft. Russell Wilson was a 3rd-round pick. He wasn't even a 1st-round pick, but yet he has a Super Bowl championship. He's considered one of the top 10 quarterbacks in the NFL. He is one of the best in the NFL at throwing on the run. He is one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL at leading his team back in the 4th quarter. He's a clutch quarterback. He is a winning quarterback. But he didn't get that way overnight. His progression was much more like Tom Brady in the fact that when him and Tom Brady were first winning with their football teams, they weren't asked to win the football game for their teams. They were asked to not lose the game. They didn't put up the gaudy stats in year 1 and year 2. But you notice year 3, year 4, year 5, guys like Wilson and Brady started growing and developing. You saw the completion percentage grow. You saw the touchdown to interception ratio grow. You saw them given more responsibility on the offense. We cannot judge Sam Darnold purely on year 1. You have to see how his career progresses and only then make a judgment. Anyone who makes a extensive judgment on Sam Darnold after his first 9-10 weeks in the NFL is a moron. You cannot judge the development of an athlete based off of just several games alone, unless the guy is absolutely incredible, like a Patrick Mahomes, or a guy is absolutely disastrous, like a Nathan Peterman. Those are two extremes of the spectrum. 95% of players fall within the middle of those extremes. You will never fully know a player until later in his career. Remember, Alex Smith wasn't his best until he got Jim Harbaugh and Andy Reid. On the flip side, you look at certain quarterbacks, they can start out hot, like a Josh Freeman, and then as their career progresses, they fizzle and fade away. Topic number 2 on this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. The sad news came out earlier this week that Stan Lee, the creator of numerous Marvel characters, had passed away at the age of 95. I know there's been a lot of things put online about Stan Lee, about his history, about the characters he created. I wanted to not rehash a lot of everything that's been said on other media platforms. I want to focus specifically on 2 aspects of Stan Lee and his relevance to not just comics, but fictional storytelling. Let me set the stage for you real quick of the world that Stan Lee came from. Stan Lee started working for the precursor company to Marvel Comics called Timely Comics in the 1940s. In the 1940s, the comic book industry was very different than it is today because a lot of the comic book characters were purely built around the war era. So you had characters like Captain America, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, the pre-DC Comics version of the Flash, Jay Garrick. A lot of these characters, they were in stories that were built around World War II or were created and entered into a world of post-World War II. So a lot of the storytelling was relative to current events. It wasn't relevant to creating their own universes. They weren't trying too much to expand. There wasn't a lot of character depth built in. It was more so just a fun escape for people, but there wasn't a lot of depth to it. As World War II faded into the background, as the 1950s came along, there was a stronger emphasis on science fiction. So there were several characters that started to wane in sales. Obviously, Batman doesn't have any superpowers, so it's really hard to tell too much science fiction with him, whereas Superman, he's supposed to be an alien from another planet. It's a little bit easier to tell science fiction with him. But at the same time, as the 1950s progressed, the comic book industry as a whole, Detective Comics, Timely Comics, what will later become Atlas Comics, all these companies were struggling. They were in danger of having to close up shop because their storytelling and their characters were not something people were interested in reading. The characters on the page were not something that people said, I want to read that, or I'm genuinely interested in that. A lot of times the characters who were selling, they were either selling because people have been buying that character for years, or because of the fact that there was something else attached to those comics, like some sort of a promotion. If you notice, in the 1970s and 80s, there were a lot of comics that were eventually produced, for example, Transformers, that were not from DC or Marvel Comics per se, but they were characters that were directly attached to toys. So whether it was toys, whether it was movies, whether it was other productions, some of the popularity of comics in the 1950s had to do with things that were not specifically those comics. So when Stan started experimenting with characters, he took his cues from what Detective Comics had done with a character of the Flash. They had put Jay Garrick's Flash into the background, and they brought in Barry Allen, a younger, much different type of character, a character that was supposed to be fun and interesting and an element that people had never seen before. So when Stan went to Timely Comics, which had become Atlas Comics, which has later become Marvel Comics, his idea was to create characters that were very different than people had ever seen. At the time, it seemed crazy for someone to create a character that was a teenager that didn't have these awe-inspiring powers. Because a lot of times, comic book characters and these fictional entities that had been written for many years were icons. They were characters you looked up to, but you could never aspire to be. Their powers and skill sets were not things based in something that anybody could relate to. Their lives weren't something that you and I could relate to. Batman's a billionaire. Superman's an alien. Wonder Woman's an Amazon. The Flash even got struck by lightning with chemicals and by a freak accident got speed. These characters were not something that you could genuinely identify with. So there was nothing given to the audience they could relate to. When Stan Lee came up with a character like Peter Parker's Spider-Man, when he created what is known as the first family of comics, the Fantastic Four, with Reed Richards, Sue Storm, Ben Grimm, and Johnny Storm, he was creating characters to not just tell stories, not just give people an escape, but he wanted to give people something they could identify with. When he created T'Challa's the Black Panther, when he resurrected Captain America and brought him into the Marvel Universe, when he created Daredevil, who was a blind superhero, he wanted to create characters that people could identify with. And that was very different than people were used to, because many times Detective Comics, which later became DC Comics, a lot of their characters were something that was unattainable. Stan didn't want to give you something that's unattainable. Stan wanted to give people of all ages something they could identify with. Even the villains sometimes you could identify with. There was a level of, you understood where Kingpin was coming from. You understood where Doctor Doom was coming from in their conflicts. You understood that, yeah, Harry Osborn is nuts, but maybe if he wasn't nuts, his goals and ambitions would be different. So Stan was creating an entire universe of original characters with the purpose of giving his audience something they could identify with. Doctor Strange basically had broken hands, and yet he learned to become a superhero through learning magic. These were all things that, yeah, it's unlikely you're ever going to be bit by a radioactive spider, but if you did, this is what would happen. And for Spider-Man, it gave teenagers somebody to root for. Through high school, through dealing with bullying, through girlfriend situations. Stan Lee even injected his own ideals upon being a teenager into the comics, because he specifically patterned Gwen Stacy, the longtime love interest of Spider-Man in the 1960s, after his own wife, because he wanted the character that Spider-Man fell in love with to have the same aesthetic and character qualities as his own wife, because he was writing so much Spider-Man. And so Stan, over the years, evolved these characters to the point that when Chris Claremont picked up the X-Men, when Steve Ditko kept running with Spider-Man, when Frank Miller took the character of Daredevil and the Punisher and expanded on those characters and their immediate universes, Stan Lee had already set a foundation of people not just wanting to read these characters because they're familiar with them, but because they identified with them. And Stan Lee's foundation allowed the expansion of those characters, not just in comics, but eventually in the movies. And that has to do with one of the reasons why Stan was a cameo in so many movies early on. Because remember, when Sony bought Spider-Man and when Fox bought the Fantastic Four and the X-Men, the theory was that Stan Lee was brought in as a consultant on the characters. So the original idea of the cameo wasn't as much for Stan to keep his foot in the door. It was more so because Stan was already there as a consultant, and they thought it'd be a fun jig to introduce him into the universe. The creator meeting his creation kind of thing on the screen. And it evolved from there. Stan's been in every movie now. And according to Kevin Feige, there's other cameos to come with Stan Lee in future Marvel movies. And I'm assuming that means Captain Marvel, Avengers 4, Spider-Man Far From Home. There's going to be something with Stan Lee in those movies. The second element I want to touch on with Stan is his approach to dealing with real-world issues. Some of you might not know this, but Stan Lee's real name was Stanley Martin Lieber. Stan came from Jewish heritage, and one of the things that gets overlooked in comics is how they've handled social issues. Stan Lee was never ignorant to the issues of prejudice. Not just because he was Jewish, but because he grew up in New York. He's originally from Manhattan. Stan understood that there were real issues out there in the world. And when you're creating characters identify with people, you can't ignore those issues. When Stan Lee created the X-Men, he purposely patterned Professor Charles Xavier off of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he purposely patterned Eric Magnus Lecter, Magneto, off of Malcolm X. Because the purpose was that he wanted to take the issues of race, civil rights, prejudice, and put it on the pages in a way that both sides could understand. Stan was very much a uniter and not a divider. So while his competitor, DC Comics, was much more interested in taking political positions, Stan was much more interested in taking positions on social and moral issues. When Cloak and Dagger were originally created in the Marvel Comics, they were characters who were on the hunt to murder drug dealers. So who comes in? The moral compass, Spider-Man. Spider-Man stops Cloak and Dagger from killing people. Other characters in Marvel have to tell Cloak and Dagger it's not okay to kill every drug dealer. Not every drug dealer is a bad person. Some of these people have certain life circumstances that brought them to this point in time. They still dealt with the issue of drugs. Drug dealing, people becoming addicted. Look at Iron Man. Tony Stark was a well-known alcoholic for a while in the comics. And there's a whole series of comics dealing with his rise, fall, and ascension from being an alcoholic and his recovery. Hank Pym in the comics hits his wife, Janet Van Dyne. That was an issue that was dealt with in the comics. And X-Men was a character that dealt with prejudice on many levels. That's why when Chris Claremont kind of brought it to the apex with God Loves and Man Kills, a story about a TV preacher who tells people that mutants are of the devil and that he creates a group of people in the background that are hunting down and killing mutants. Charles Xavier and the other mutants have to deal with it, not just because they're able to deal with it because of their powers, but they have to deal with it in a very diplomatic manner because this man's on TV. And Charles Xavier explains to the children that his message of hate is not from God. These are issues that have to be dealt with in today's world as well. But Stan and the Marvel writers have been dealing with it for 40, 50 years. Black Panther came out long before any other African American characters came along, and he was put into the forefront. You look at the creation of multiple characters in the Marvel Cinematic Universe who were of different races and different genders. Marvel was one of the few comics who had ultra powerful women like Carol Danvers, Storm, later Jean Grey through the Phoenix Force. Marvel was putting these women on the forefront. It was Marvel who was putting issues on the forefront of their comics. And Stan Lee understood, as a Jewish man who saw anti-Semitism in the world, who lived in New York and saw the issues with civil rights, saw the different issues that go on in the world with the rich versus the poor and the government. Even Captain America at one point in the comics renounces his country because he doesn't like what the country is doing, and he goes on to become the nomad, also known as the Captain. These are all things that Stan did because he wanted his heroes, Spider-Man, Captain America, he wanted the good guys to be good. And he wanted the bad guys to be either purely evil or to have character flaws to show that you may have good intentions, but still, as the old saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. He wanted to differentiate between what is right and what is wrong with his comics. And he was trying to do that in a way that was a unifier and not a divider. The depth of these characters, the storytelling, the understanding of putting them in the real world, not creating a Gotham or a Star City or a Metropolis. No, he's putting Spider-Man in New York. He's putting the West Coast Avengers in California. He's explaining why the Vikings worshipped Odin and Thor in Scandinavia. He's explaining his version of how the pyramids were built because of En-Sabah-Nur, Apocalypse, one of the most powerful mutants of all time back in ancient Egypt. He's doing all of these interconnectings and these interweavings as part of not just building this massive universe, but to tell stories that give people hope. And I think that's the biggest takeaway I want to give people today, and that is, when you think of Stan Lee, he created these characters to give you hope. He didn't want you walking away miserable and negative about life in the world. He wanted you to feel like there was some hero, there was some character, there was somebody in the world, fiction it may be, that makes you believe that you can do anything. That life will not always be this bad. That you can come out the other side. Stan cared about people. That's why he spent hours upon hours signing autographs and taking pictures with millions of people over the last 30 years. Because Stan understood that what he had done is he had given people someone to look up to, an escape, and a moral compass that they might not have had otherwise when he started creating these characters back in the late 50s, early 60s. Stan Lee's impact on storytelling, character development, character evolution, as well as presentation has had an impact upon massive platforms. And thanks to him, just to think about all the millions of people who have gotten jobs because of these Marvel characters as well. Topic number 3 on this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. So this week, it was made official. Jimmy Butler traded to the 76ers. He's already now played in 2 games in the NBA with the 76ers. The 4-time All-Star and 4-time All-Defensive All-NBA player basically forced his way out of Minnesota. And I know for some people there's been a lot of negativity built around Jimmy Butler. And I wanted to address it because I think that Butler is probably one of the most misunderstood players in the NBA today. And I say that because Butler is a guy who has come off as, oh, he can't get along with young players, or that Butler is a guy that, people won't like, or Butler is a guy that he's a coach killer, or he doesn't get along with people. And a lot of that is extremely untrue. People misconstrue Butler's competitive nature with Butler being a malcontent or being mean. Let's take a minute to understand where Butler comes from. Butler is a guy who was drafted with the 30th overall pick in the 2011 NBA draft. So he was not a big-time top 5 pick like a Joel Embiid, a Karl Anthony Towns, a LeBron James, a Ben Simmons. he's not one of those guys. In fact, to start his NBA career, his first 2 years, he only started 20 games altogether, those first couple years. Butler didn't become an all-star player until his fourth season in the NBA. He had to earn his way into the lineup. He had to earn his keep in the league. He wasn't considered a star until the age of 25 in a league where LeBron and Kobe and many other players came in the league at 18 and 19 years old. Butler, in some ways, is a late bloomer. And there's a few reasons why for that. Jimmy Butler, who's originally from Houston, Texas, was homeless as a teenager. He was not highly recruited coming out of high school. After spending time in junior college, he would later attend the University of Marquette, and his first year at the University of Marquette didn't start a single game. His final 2 years at Marquette is when he started making his mark as a offensive and defensive impact player. Over his career, he's developed into an offensive scorer, a guy who can put up 20-plus points a night, while still getting his defensive numbers of 1 to 2 steals a game. Butler is misunderstood because Butler is an alpha in the world full of soft people. Today's NBA is soft. Half these players, if you put them in the 90s and the 80s, they would go home crying. They cry if someone bangs into them. They complain more than anyone I've ever seen about the stupidest little thing. The reason why Butler had issues in Minnesota is because while he was grinding at practice, Karl Anthony Towns and Andrew Wiggins were too busy playing Fortnite. Jimmy Butler was mad because when he's trying to win basketball games and recover from his injuries, his teammates are not giving their best on the basketball court. Jimmy Butler views basketball not just as a competitor, but as something that saved his life. The money he's making in the NBA, when he says it's not about the money, he's serious. For him, it's not about making the max number of dollars. It's not, oh man, well, one team could pay me 25, but the other could pay me 30 million. No, he's saying he's thanking God that he even has the opportunity to make money. Jimmy Butler is a guy who counts his blessings. He understood what a privilege it is that basketball has given him a college education, has given him money to set up his family for the rest of his life. He will never have to worry about money as long as he maintains what he's doing in a frugal manner that he's done. Many NBA players are privileged. They think that they are entitled. They're soft. They don't have the work ethic or the intensity that Jimmy Butler does. When Michael Jordan punched Steve Kerr in the face, Steve Kerr didn't cry about it. He didn't demand a trade back in the 90s. He didn't tell the coach, I don't want to play with Michael anymore. He didn't demand a pay raise. He didn't demand Jordan to be suspended. You know what he did? He went out and was a major contributor to one of the greatest basketball teams of all time when the Chicago Bulls won 72 games. And by the end of the year, who was passing in the ball for those big shots? It was Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan, the man who had punched Kerr in the face months earlier at an early season practice because he was mad at him, was the same one passing him the ball. Steve would hit the three, and Michael would run over and hug him. Because Steve Kerr wasn't soft. Michael Jordan was the ultra competitor. When Kobe Bryant would rub guys the wrong way in the mid-2000s because he was so competitive, it wasn't because Kobe was a bad person, but because Kobe's work ethic eclipsed guys like Smush Parker. It's not that Jimmy Butler is a malcontent. It's that Jimmy Butler is an ultra-competitive alpha dog in a world full of soft betas. Let's be realistic. Karl Anthony Towns is passive. Andrew Wiggins, we're still waiting him to touch his potential as a basketball player. There are a lot of young people in today's society who do not appreciate what it means to earn the opportunity given to you. Many of these kids grow up in a world because of AAU and because of high school and college recruiting. They're recruited to go to a high school, they're recruited to go to college. They have scouts coming to see them. They have agents trying to talk to them. They have shoe companies offering them money, but they never play an NBA game. but many of these guys haven't earned the opportunity. One of the reasons why there's so many busts in the NBA lottery isn't just because teams are not the best evaluators of talent, they're also not the best evaluators of character. There's a reason why guys like Paul George and Klay Thompson, who were not drafted in the top 5, become all-stars, because they fought and clawed their way to earn their opportunity. Steph Curry had 2 point guards picked ahead of him in his draft. Yet Steph Curry is the 2-time NBA MVP and 3-time NBA champion. Ricky Rubio, he's never won a championship. Johnny Flynn fizzled out of the league in a couple years. What's the difference between Steph Curry and Johnny Flynn? Steph Curry injured his ankles and his knees and came back and became a better player. He earned his way to stardom. From Davidson to the Golden State Warriors, helping them become NBA champions. Johnny Flynn, highly recruited out of high school, went to Syracuse, big-time university, had all these expectations placed on him, and he fizzled out. He didn't have the it factor that a guy like Steph Curry has. In today's NBA, Draymond Green is quote-unquote mean. Draymond Green gets suspended because the Warriors are worried about Kevin Durant's feelings. Kevin Durant would have been eaten alive in the 1980s. Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, in the 90s, Michael Jordan, Hakeem Olajuwon, Patrick Ewing. You know why Jimmy Butler is going to be just fine in Philadelphia? Because he's playing on a team with guys who have a similar work ethic to him. Joel Embiid's only been playing basketball for about 9 years of his life. He's had to come back from multiple injuries, back injury, broken feet, knee injury. He knows, Joel Embiid, what it means to earn your keep. Ben Simmons is a competitor on both ends of the basketball court. He understands that you cannot lollygag through life. Whether you like or dislike Markelle Fultz or whatever your opinion of is, we know that he worked hard this summer to become a better player and try to improve his shot. Jimmy Butler's beef with players and coaches historically has not been because he's a malcontent, but because he's a competitor. People misconstrue being a competitor and being an alpha with being mean. The reality is that society as a whole is soft. People worry about their feelings being hurt. We give up participation trophies. Jimmy Butler comes from a world where participation trophies didn't put food on his plate, where participation trophies weren't going to pay his way through college, where participation trophies weren't going to keep him on an NBA roster. In a world full of guys who never meet their potential, Jimmy Butler has exponentially grown his potential. He has made something of himself. Jimmy Butler is not a malcontent. He's not a locker room cancer. Jimmy Butler is an alpha dog competitor in a world where soft NBA players misunderstand him. Understand the difference and ask yourself, if you think Jimmy Butler is the problem, reevaluate the people who have a problem with Jimmy Butler and then rethink about your position on the 29-year-old former homeless guy from Texas who has turned himself into one of the top 20 players in the NBA today. Topic number 4 on this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. You've heard me speak about Supergirl in the past, so part of it is because I'm not watching the show because I personally love the character or the story or anything like that, but because I understand that there's constant crossover and linkage between the Arrow, the Flash, Supergirl, and now Black Lightning of Batwoman starting next year, and DC Legends of Tomorrow. These are all characters and universes that the CW and DC has evolved on the television screen for the last few years. And while Supergirl doesn't have the best ratings of the superhero shows on the CW, they've at least held steady enough for the CW to continue with the show and to evolve it. Now, in their 4th season, Supergirl has some changes to the cast. There was no more Winn on the show. They brought the character Brainy from the future to fulfill Winn's role in the present day. They They have Alex Danvers now running the DEO. And this season of Supergirl has again gotten away from the original intent of the show. And it's not to say that the original intent is what you have to do all the time. I'm not a believer that you always have to go by the original intent. Obviously, the original plan and intent for Iron Man, the movie, from Iron Man 1 to Iron Man 2 to Avengers, just like the situation with Guardians of the Galaxy and Thor. If you go to the DC universe, they started out with Arrow, and then they got The Flash, and then they got DC Legends of Tomorrow and Supergirl. Supergirl was originally put on CBS, and then was moved to CW, which was the right move. It should have been on the CW all along and not CBS. So I'm not saying original intent is the end-all, be-all. Supergirl's original premise was a superhero women for females with strong female characters. It was supposed to give women characters and ideas that they weren't getting from male shows because they have strong women characters, they have more female-friendly storylines, etc. What we've instead gotten from the show is not always the best character development, sometimes a dysfunctional understanding of what it means to be a hero, a female superhero who really is still trying to find herself. She's not really, it's not that she's not a strong female character, but that she doesn't fully understand what it means to be a strong character herself. So you're watching this character develop and try to find herself and figure out the world and life. And I get it. It's a character that some people can identify with. But for a viewer like myself, the way they're going about it has always been very clunky and very just falling short of the mark at times. And season 4, they decided to take a political position. And it's a political position that, let's be realistic, they're not handling properly at all. And what is very different, as I was explaining about Marvel Comics with Stan Lee earlier, Stan Lee took moral and social positions. DC has always been more of the political position, dealing with environmentalism, dealing with, gender bias specifically in politics, dealing with, nuclear war and things like that. You're dealing with more political based perspectives. So you look at Supergirl, now what are they doing? They're using the alien situation in National City to have this ongoing conversation about immigration, right? Because technically all these aliens are illegal immigrants, and the President of the United States gave them a level of amnesty and U.S. citizenship, but then later people find out that she herself as an alien had been lying about her identity for years. So as a result, you're looking at, okay, can we trust the immigrants? Can we trust the aliens? Well, there are good and bad immigrants. They're not all bad. And so they're trying to deal with that issue and deal with prejudice. And they also bring in now a transgender female character. And she tells the African-American CEO guy that she understands what prejudice is like. And it's all so clunky, and so they're trying to do something, but they're doing it in a way that just comes off as preachy. There are 30, 40, 50 years of comic book history that has been dealing with issues of prejudice and racism and a multitude of political and social and moral conundrums in our society. But even if you agreed or disagreed with the perspective, whether it was Marvel or DC Comics, it was never done in a way that was blatantly preachy like Supergirl is getting. It's as if Supergirl doesn't care about the people outside of the 1.2 million viewers they have. And they don't even care if they lose some viewers along the way. They just want to push their agenda. And their agenda is that these immigrants and these oppressed groups of people are all misunderstood, and we all need to give them a chance and get along. And it's a concept that is very, very mishandled by Supergirl's show because, one, you're not addressing the real issue. The real issue with prejudice isn't because people are afraid of what they don't understand. The real issue with prejudice is prejudice comes from a place people use the rationalization that, well, you grew up in hate, right? You grew up with hating people. But even the character Agent of Liberty on the show is shown that he evolved from defending the aliens to hating the aliens. And why is that? Because he feels the world is against him. But why does he feel like the world is against him? Is it against him because it genuinely is? Or is it against him because he chooses to see it that way? And that's the problem that's not addressed on the show. The show does not have a full grasp of what it means to love and hate. See, people use words like racism, hate, and other descriptions without understanding the source of these things. You can't live in a world and try to explain evil without understanding where evil comes from. Whether you believe in God or not, most people understand that there is a level of understanding good and evil, and that there is a root source of it. Not all criminals can be rehabilitated. Not all good people are going to do bad things if pushed to the edge. One of the reasons why Christopher Nolan's movies had so much pushback before they hit theaters was because Christopher Nolan was pushing against concepts in Hollywood. When he was dealing with issues that he dealt with in The Dark Knight, Batman Begins, Dark Knight Rises, they were positions that dealt with things that some people in Hollywood considered sacred cows, or some people in Hollywood considered too political or too agenda driven, too many subversive concepts, dealing with things like anarchy, dealing with good and evil, dealing with morality, dealing with psychology and sociology. In many ways, Christopher Nolan understood the purpose of the Batman character better than the people who were telling him that his ideas weren't a good idea. And that's why the Batman movies, unlike the majority of DC movies, made a ridiculous amount of billions of dollars in theater and outside of theaters, because those movies were so great storytelling, such great character development, and dealt with concepts head on, but didn't preach at you about it. It drew a line, put their stake in the ground, and said, this is the position we're taking, because we're living in reality. We're not going to live in a world of what ifs, conjecture, and theory. And that's part of the problem with many of these DC characters, like Supergirl. They're not based in reality. Many of Supergirl's problems, while legitimate, some of it's also self-created. You never run into a lot of people in Supergirl's life who give her a lot of constructive criticism outside of John Jones, Martian Manhunter, who is the former head of the DEO. Many times it's only one perspective or the other. Many times it's, oh, you either believe the aliens should be allowed to live here or you hate the aliens. You're not finding anybody in the show yet that takes the middle ground. You're not finding someone in the show that's taking the middle position. The position to say it's not about pro or anti-immigration or pro or anti-alien, or either an angry, hateful, racist, and bigot, or you love everybody. There's a middle ground too. And the show hasn't found the middle ground. And that's where it's no longer about dealing with social issues. It's no longer dealing with prejudice. It's taking a political position. Now, whether you agree with Supergirl's views and perspective and worldview, that's not what I'm arguing here. What I'm arguing here is the old axiom that comes from legal circles. Alan Dershowitz wrote about it in many of his books. There are facts, and then there are true facts. There are people who present facts that support their belief and theories and view of the world. And then there are people who find information and facts and then develop an opinion and worldview out of the information they've gathered. A lot of times, the people who are, I believe, writing the show Supergirl, they're creating storylines and situations that support their worldview. They're creating a reality that supports their views of the world. They're developing a reality on the show to support their view of the world. Just like V for Vendetta purposely didn't address certain issues in the movie, but created this extreme pro and anti stance when it came to the antagonist and his manipulated pupil, which was Natalie Portman's character. In Alan Dershowitz's book, Shouting Fire, he explained that the way to understand both sides of an argument is to understand that there is never two sides of the same argument. There is always three. There is the antagonist, there is the protagonist, and there's the independent bystander viewing both sides. That's why in our legal system, we have a judge and jury. We don't have just the prosecution versus the defense duking it out. You have a judge operating as the independent arbitrator to make sure a case proceeds properly. That's why you're supposed to have an independent jury evaluate the merits of a case. So when dealing with these issues, where Supergirl misses the mark is she doesn't do what Chris Claremont did with X-Men. When Chris Claremont dealt with racism, when he dealt with hate, when he dealt with bigotry, when he dealt with all these different issues and all these deep concepts, it wasn't just pro and anti-mutant. It wasn't just pro and anti-anything. You had characters from all different angles and aspects being dealt with. Wolverine had to be talked off the ledge. He thought, well, we should just kill this guy because he's saying that people should kill mutants, so we should kill all of them. And Professor Xavier says that's not the right way to do it. Murdering people who want to murder you doesn't solve the problem. Magneto believed that mutants should be the superior race. Magneto said, we should rule the world. We should rule the humans. Apocalypse believed that all humans should be eradicated and that mutants should be the only thing living on Earth. The Sentinel program was created to eliminate the mutant problem. You're getting multiple sides of the same issue. You're getting multiple extremes of the same problem. You're not getting just pro and against. You're not just getting liberals versus conservatives. You're getting all sides coming to the table in a well thought out, well written story. Supergirl has and will always fall short of what was done with the X-Men in comics, what has been attempted to be done with X-Men in the movies, which is when you're dealing with prejudice, bigotry, and any type of anti-fill in the blank. The goal isn't to find a reality that supports your perspective. The goal is to check your perspective at the door and find information and then come to a conclusion. At the end of the day, I'm watching Supergirl so I understand how it links up to the rest of the universe. I'm not watching it for the politics. Does it affect me? Not really. I'm not going to be one of those people who doesn't watch a show just because of its politics. But I don't want to say that I'm naive to the other perspectives as well. You can watch something and not agree with everything that's said and done on a show. We all do it. At the end of the day, Supergirl does not understand what it means to give a full 360-degree perspective on issues. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that we live in a world where people are not taught critical thinking anymore, and they're much more emotionally reactive than provocative in thought. And possibly Supergirl is much more a reflection of a certain part of culture than it is actually telling good stories. Thanks for listening to this week's edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. If you have any thoughts or perspectives on the topics we talked about, drop it in the comment section below. If you like this podcast, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. You catch me for each and every episode when I deal with my perspective on the world of sports and comic books. I'm Josh Hennig. You've been listening to the Mutant Blitz Podcast. Catch you next time.